Canada's economy is being pulled apart from every direction, and the clock is running out. There is a moment in every country's economic history where the gap between how things look from the outside and how they actually are on the inside becomes impossible to ignore. Canada is in that moment right now, and I want to walk you through exactly why. Because the picture emerging in 2026 is more complicated, more layered, and more consequential than almost anything you're seeing in the daily headlines. Let's start with what sounds like good news, because there actually is some. Canada moved past the peak of tariff-related shocks, and a recession stemming from them is no longer the base case scenario for the economy. The labor market held together better than most analysts expected. About 180,000 jobs were created in the final 3 months of 2025, pushing the unemployment rate down to 6.5% in November. And consumer spending helped prop up the economy, partly driven by a surge in Buy Canadian sentiment, with more people choosing to travel and spend closer to home. So, on the surface, Canada dodged the worst. That's real. That matters. But here's the thing. Dodging the worst is not the same as being out of danger. And when you look at what's actually underneath these numbers, you start to see a country navigating a corridor so narrow that even a moderate shock from the wrong direction could have serious consequences. That is not alarmism. That is what serious institutions are telling us right now in plain language. The Bank of Canada itself, in its most recent monetary policy report, confirmed that GDP growth is expected to average only about 1.25% over the next 2 years. Part of that softness reflects cyclical weakness, and part reflects something more permanent, structural change. Lower U.S. demand for Canadian exports, trade-related uncertainty, increased trade friction, and slower population growth have all combined to pull down Canada's potential growth path. That last part is the one that doesn't get enough attention. It's not just that the economy is running slow, it's that the ceiling itself has been lowered. Exports of non-energy goods dropped sharply after U.S. tariffs came into effect. Key industries including autos, steel, aluminum, copper, and forestry continue to face tariffs as high as 50%, and those sectoral tariffs are not going away quietly. Meanwhile, the effects of tariffs remain concentrated in specific sectors and regions, particularly southwestern Ontario, where unemployment in some areas ranges from 9 to 11%, contrasting sharply with areas maintaining much lower unemployment rates. So when people tell you Canada avoided a recession, they're technically right, but they're describing a national average that conceals what amounts to a localized economic crisis for hundreds of thousands of workers and families in the most trade-exposed parts of the country. And then there is the agreement that is supposed to govern all of this, the CUSMA review, the July 1, 2026 deadline that everything is building toward. Here's what you need to understand about this. The USMCA, which undergirds North America's competitiveness, will undergo a formal review starting in July 2026. What was once expected to be a routine assessment aimed at improving implementation is now likely to become a high-stakes negotiation. The Trump administration is poised to seek additional concessions from Mexico and Canada on long-standing trade disputes, while also leveraging the review to address non-trade issues like migration, drug trafficking, and continental defense. This is not routine maintenance. This is a restructuring of the entire framework under which Canada's export economy operates. And here's where it gets worse. As of mid-March 2026, the U.S. ambassador to Canada publicly stated there have been no substantive talks between Washington and Ottawa since October. The U.S. wants an agreement but is facing headwinds in the negotiations. Think about what that means. We are roughly 90 days from the most consequential trade deadline Canada has faced in a generation, and the two sides have not had a substantive conversation in 5 months. Prime Minister Carney himself has admitted there is little evidence Canada will secure a trade deal that does not impose some tariffs. The optimistic assumption that most economic forecasts are built on, that tariff rates on Canadian goods drop dramatically after July, is looking shakier by the week. If the 2026 review weakens customs foundation, projections suggest that bilateral trade could contract by 20 to 30%, disrupting the integrated supply chains that underpin North American manufacturing. The automotive sector alone represents up to $120 billion in annual customs trade, and it sits directly in the crosshairs of the most contested parts of the negotiation. For industries where products cross the border multiple times during assembly, every round of uncertainty is itself a cost that compounds with every planning cycle. But wait, because the trade relationship is only one of the forces pressing down on this economy simultaneously. The domestic side of the picture has its own vulnerabilities. Consumption spending, which accounts for about 60% of Canadian GDP, looks vulnerable amid weak population growth, a challenging labor market, and record-high debt. The burden of debt servicing already absorbs more than 14% of household disposable incomes, and now, on top of that, comes the mortgage renewal wave that has been building for 2 years. About 60% of all outstanding mortgages in Canada are expected to renew in 2025 or 2026. For those with 5-year fixed-rate mortgages renewing in 2026, the Bank of Canada estimates an average payment increase of around 20%. That is not a rounding error. That is a meaningful and sustained hit to household cash flow, arriving at exactly the moment when tariff uncertainty is highest and job market conditions in the most exposed regions are weakest. Delinquency pressures in the Greater Toronto Area are expected to remain elevated throughout 2026. High debt levels and softening resale market liquidity are contributing to growing financial pressures in Vancouver. And critically, regions with high exposure to tariffs are increasingly at risk, with job losses already evident in certain industries and regions heavily impacted by trade conflict, meaning we may see a growing number of households struggling to meet both non-mortgage and mortgage payments simultaneously. Now here's the part that rarely gets explained clearly enough. The Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve are not moving in the same direction at the same speed. The Bank of Canada brought its overnight rate down through an aggressive cutting cycle. The trade conflict has spilled over to broader economic weakness, including weak business investment across sectors. But tariffs have also increased costs and reduced the efficiency of the economy. That means the bank is simultaneously fighting weak growth and cost pressures from above. That is the stagflation trap. You cannot cut rates aggressively to stimulate a softening economy if inflation refuses to cooperate. And right now, a new conflict in the Middle East has pushed crude oil benchmarks sharply higher through disruptions at the Strait of Hormuz, with roughly 20% of the world's oil and a quarter of Asia's LNG imports transiting through that route. Higher energy prices are inflationary globally, and if inflation stays elevated, the room to cut rates further narrows considerably. The regional picture inside Canada makes this even more complex. Canadian provinces are experiencing deeply differentiated impacts. Resource-rich Alberta and Saskatchewan are projected to grow at 2.3% and 2.1% respectively, supported by energy infrastructure and agricultural output. But trade-exposed Ontario and Quebec are each projected at only 1.1%, weighed down by tariffs on steel, aluminum, and lumber. British Columbia faces similar headwinds with a projected 1.2% growth rate. This is not one Canadian economy, it is several economies sharing a currency, a central bank, and a federal budget, but experiencing radically different levels of stress. And this is where the political dimension becomes inseparable from the economic one. A federal government trying to execute a national economic strategy needs the provinces moving broadly in the same direction. Right now, they are not. The resource-rich West is focused on energy development and its own trade exposure to China through agricultural tariffs. Central Canada is living in the immediate shadow of U.S. trade conflict. The constitutional tools that used to be considered last resorts are being deployed routinely, and businesses trying to plan investments across provincial lines are operating in what analysts describe as a patchwork of policy regimes, with real costs for capital allocation and long-term planning. Meanwhile, Canada is still in the early phases of recalibrating its economy toward new products and customers. Supply chains have started to shift. Goods imports from the United States have declined, while those from other countries have increased. That diversification is real, but businesses are hoping for trade diversification and productivity gains that are not likely to help much in 2026 itself. The pivot is underway, it is just not moving fast enough to absorb the pressure arriving this year. Here's what the honest version of the base case actually requires. The most significant downside risk to Canada's economic outlook is a renewed escalation in trade disruption, particularly higher tariffs imposed by major trading partners. Any revisions to USMCA that materially restrict Canadian exporters' access to the U.S. market would significantly influence trade flows, business investment, and ultimately growth. In today's volatile geopolitical environment, trade policy shocks can arise and shift rapidly. The base case is not pessimistic, but it is fragile. It depends on a set of conditions holding simultaneously: a USMCA outcome that doesn't devastate export-dependent sectors, commodity markets that don't push inflation to the point of forcing rate hikes, a mortgage renewal cycle that strains households without breaking them, and a bilateral relationship with Washington that remains transactional rather than punitive.
The Bank of Canada has been explicit about the downside scenario. If the Canadian economy fails to restructure, productivity and GDP growth do not recover. Canada becomes a less attractive place to invest. Businesses become less competitive. Job and wage growth stay weak, incomes don't recover, and affordability worsens. That is the scenario that serious policymakers are working to prevent, and the reason they're working so hard to prevent it is that it is not a remote tail risk. It is a plausible outcome if the next 4 months go badly in Geneva, Washington, or both. So where does this actually leave us? Canada enters the second quarter of 2026 with a labor market that has stabilized, a recession that has been avoided, and a government that is spending aggressively to buffer the economy against the shocks already in motion. Those are genuine strengths, but the CUSMA clock is ticking. The mortgage renewal wave is cresting. The regional divide is widening. The energy markets are volatile, and the bilateral relationship that has defined this country's economic model for 3 decades is being renegotiated by an administration that has repeatedly made clear it sees trade as a lever, not a partnership. The margin for error is thin. The decisions being made in the next 90 days will determine whether Canada comes through this transition more resilient, or whether 2026 becomes the year the vulnerability stack finally broke through. I'm genuinely curious what you think, because when I look at this, I see a country with real capacity, an educated workforce, a resource base that the world still needs, and institutions that have held together under real pressure. But I also see a country where the timing of multiple crises is almost impossibly difficult. Some people look at the stabilization data and see a corner being turned. Others look at the CUSMA impasse, the regional fractures, and the household debt levels, and they see a system running out of room. Where do you think this goes from here? And if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, the kind that goes past the surface, past the talking points, and into what's actually happening and why, then hit that like button right now, because it genuinely helps this content reach more people who are trying to understand what's coming. Subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one, because what happens between now and July 2026 is going to move fast, and when it does, you'll want to already be in the room.